I'm Amanda Walker and you're watching IMF Today, live from the annual meetings here in Washington, D.C. Here's what's coming up today.
Terror has to lose. Ukraine has to win, and that's absolutely real with your support.
No country, no organization can win the fight against the climate crisis alone. But together, we can do it.
The fiscal monitor message is clear. Be prepared. Be prepared for a shock-prone world.
Hello and welcome to IMF Today. I'm Amanda Walker. Now, it's been a busy day here at the IMF annual meetings in Washington, D.C. But perhaps the biggest headline came in the last few hours when IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva and World Bank Group President David Malpass met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
At this time when the terrorist state is trying to intimidate us even more, we have to respond to the Russian terror with a stronger and even more meaningful collaboration. This is the true defense, our joint defense of our shared democracy, our mode of life. Terror has to lose. Ukraine has to win, and that's absolutely real with your support.
No doubt, in front of us is going to be a difficult 2023. Hopefully the war would end sooner rather than later. But from what we are seeing, we have to be there for the Ukrainian people. This group has mobilized $35 billion. What we need to look into is how to ensure sustainability of the economy, and that would require a significant effort.
Now, I asked European Department Director Alfred Kammer about how the fund decided in terms of the level of money, the amount of money it would be giving.
We were working from day one with the Ukrainian authorities in terms of helping them support macroeconomic stability in the country. So we were discussing with the National Bank and with the government their funding needs. We are looking at the budget figures, and we came up with a number which we used for fundraising over the last 7 months. And that number, the $5 billion per month, which we identified early on, generated in the end external financing for Ukraine by partners abroad of $35 billion committed for 2022. This is a historic amount. This was raised in a very fast and efficient way, and this is a big success for Ukraine and a success for the international community in order to support Ukraine.
And what is the response from Ukraine from your negotiations? I'm assuming they are, extremely grateful for this. Did they ask for more? Is this kind of what they had hoped for?
First, I should say that Ukraine, the authorities, both the National Bank as well as the government, did a fantastic effort in terms of maintaining strategy. So inflation was contained, the exchange rate stability was guaranteed, and whatever they could do in terms of keeping the economy intact with emergency measures, but also with normal economic policies was done. And that was a big success of the authorities. We had an initial discussion with Ukrainian authorities. We are estimating that the financing requirement for the budget, the external financing requirement, is between $3 to $4 billion per month in 2023. We will have a budget discussion with them, where we have a mission going out to discuss the particular details with them. Then we will narrow down this number, and then we will discuss it, of course, together with the Ukrainian authorities, with the international community. in order to find ways, in order to meet this funding request. And what we are planning to do as part of that is to establish an Ukraine Economic Forum that will help in terms of identifying what the number is, helping identify how the response is going to be coordinated in order to support the authorities in their effort to maintain macro stability during this period.
And you touched on it there, but specifically, how will this money be spent? What will it be used for? What's the goal here?
The idea is to support the budget of the Ukrainian authority. They will also use the domestic debt market. And not to forget, we are coming back to a normalization of economic policies. So they're also looking at tax measures in order to generate tax revenue to support the budget.
And how does the IMF support fit into the international response?
So we come in a number of ways. One way of coming in was very early by providing financing, $1.4 billion in emergency financing. Last Friday, we again dispersed emergency financing under our new food window of $1.3 billion US dollars. So we are coming in with financing. That's one part. The second part is we are helping to create a macroeconomic framework that will help identify financing gaps, that will help identify the coordination requirements between monetary and budgetary and fiscal policy, and that will also give the donors a framework when disbursements are expected in order to support the authorities in carrying out their budget.
And do you see this as a long-term commitment?
Our commitment with Ukraine is long-term indeed. We have been working together with Ukraine now for over 30 years, and we have a strong partnership with Ukraine in place, and that partnership will continue.
Alfred Kammer, thank you for joining us on IMF Today.
Thank you very much.
Earlier in the morning, the Fiscal Monitor report was released, filled with policies for people to tackle what Fiscal Affairs Department Director Vita Gasper called painful trade-offs.
The rise of extreme poverty and food insecurity that began before the pandemic is very concerning. Emergency support is necessary. The food crisis should be addressed at the global level by a broad set of initiatives, including lifting restrictions on food and fertilizer exports. Some emergency financing will be available through the new food shock window under the IMF's Emergency Financing Toolkit. But more is needed, including through rechanneling of wealthier countries' allocation of the IMF's special drawing rights to poorer countries. At the national level, countries must prioritize food security. In many cases, binding financing constraints make the trade-offs very painful for countries. Coordinated global action is thus urgent. Coordinated global action is also urgent for climate transition. If we want to avert a catastrophic outcome, the time to act is now.
So how do you create policies for people and then get them to be embraced by a global community with different needs? Joining me now are Zainab Ahmed, the Minister of Finance of Nigeria, and Timothy Antoine, the Governor of the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. So welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us on IMF Today. We'll talk about the details of your hopes, your aims and objectives of being here. But first I want to know what it's like being here. We all have these shared problems, global problems at the moment, but each of you will have specific concerns for your own countries. How do you make sure that your voice is heard? Minister, can we start with you?
Well, it's always nice being here, and it's really great to be here and having this in-person meeting.
Does it make a difference?
Yeah, it makes a difference. You just feel more connected to people, and the problems become more real than when you're meeting virtually. What are my greatest concerns?
Well, yeah. What are you coming here with? What is at top of your list?
We have a very tight fiscal space amidst a number of challenges all happening at the same time. We're still in the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, We have climate change issues in our country. We're beginning to have floods, and it's really, the scale is increasing. There's this inflation that is also affecting us, putting more of our people in poverty, and we have security issues within the country, and this is all within a very tight fiscal space. So it's a difficult time for us, but I'm sure for a lot of other countries. We come here with the hope that between the fund and the bank, that we'll be able to garner some support that will help us in being able to meet some of the challenges that we currently have, and also being able to listen and learn from some of the experiences of our colleagues, especially African countries that have similar problems with us, what they have done that we can learn from, and be able to come together and have common positions on issues that affect us as a sub-region.
Governor, what is your top priority here, and how do you make sure 190 countries, how do you make sure your voice is heard?
Well, clearly for us, inflation is real. It's hurting our people. It's biting hard, on the back of COVID, and of course, climate is existential. So for us, this week we want to have common cause. We want to have one voice. We want to make sure that the smallest members of the fund and the World Bank are heard. We are the smallest members, many of our small states from the Caribbean, which happen to also be the hardest hit by climate change. So our hope is to bring a very clear message that we are out of time and we need to act collectively. And I think this forum, the coming together at these annual meetings, is really an opportunity for us to hear each other and then to take collective action. When we are in a struggle, as we are now, solidarity is important. And I think the feeling that we're not in it alone, we're together, and we will take action together is very encouraging and frankly very empowering. So that is our expectation, that we will be heard and that there will be collective action to address some of the pressing issues on inflation, on climate, among other things.
So the fiscal monitor is talking about policies for the people. As you see it, what is the best way to help the people of Nigeria through this difficult time?
Well, it's in being able to identify and provide direct support to the most affected people, the poor and the vulnerable. And we have been doing that under our National Social Investment Program, where we provide some kind of cash transfers and support to the people that are most affected. What we found since the COVID is that there is an increasing number of people that are becoming vulnerable in the urban areas, while the numbers are a bit more stable in the rural areas. So they are more urban poor now, and the program we designed for them has to be slightly different from what we designed for the rural poor. And also to be able to provide circa to small businesses that that are the largest employer of people. During the COVID, we have had to provide special support to small businesses. We removed taxes for the very small businesses, no company income tax. For the medium-sized businesses, we reduced their tax rates from 30% to 20%. The idea is so that they can retain resources within their businesses to be able to maintain their businesses, grow their businesses, and employ people, and also keep people that they employ. The informal sector in Nigeria is a very, very large contributor to the GDP. And while we are limited in terms of resources, we can't give them cash. We use fiscal tools to support them.
And Governor, how important at this difficult time is the role of the IMF for you and your country?
Very important. IMF does two critical things. I mean, beyond surveillance, it provides capacity development and financial support. We need both at this time. So obviously we commend the IMF on the Resilience Sustainability Trust, which was recently launched, which I understand is already garnering interest. I know Barbados from the Caribbean signed up and others are signing up. So that's important, but as we spoke earlier in an earlier panel, there's a lot of capacity development required in our region. I mean, I gave a simple example of an IMF study in 2018 that showed that the frequency of natural disasters in the Caribbean is 7 times higher than any other part of the world. And the damage and loss from natural disasters is 6 times higher in the Caribbean than the global average. So you begin to understand the magnitude, not of just the shocks, but the needs, both in terms of capacity and financing. So we need the IMF, we need the World Bank, and other multilaterals to step up. We certainly need countries to make and keep their commitments under the Paris Agreement. The $100 billion that was promised per year has not materialized. We're very concerned about that. And I know there will be a strong message, not just this week, but going into COP27, about the need for us to meet our commitments because we are running out of time. I think the managing director of the fund said it very well last week. We can survive inflation, we can survive a recession, but we will not survive a climate catastrophe if we do not act now. That, to me, is poignant and really requires us to move. So, again, we need to see a really strong effort by our countries, the large countries and small, to do their part in this fight.
Okay. Governor, Minister, thank you both so much for joining us on IMF Today.
Thank you very much for having us.
So let's get back to those 3 shocks setting the stage for these meetings: Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, and climate change. We've heard them referred to over and over again, from Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva's curtain raiser speech last week to this week's World Economic Outlook and today's Fiscal Monitor. Today, the head of COP26 was among those joining the Managing Director on a panel tackling how to get to net zero.
So we have to acknowledge that mankind is causing greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change, and that it's an actionable thing for this group, but for the whole world.
I was at the G20 climate ministers meeting a few months ago in Indonesia. It was really challenging because, frankly, there were some of the biggest emitters who were looking to backslide on what had been agreed in Paris and been agreed in Glasgow. Now, we can't have that, right? When we make agreements at an international level, we have to stick to them. And therefore, my view is that when it comes to climate, what we agreed in Paris, what we agreed in Glasgow, have to be the baseline of our ambition. We cannot move from that. And what we then need is the multilateral system to go into COP27 with hope and positivity. And I've seen that here at this meeting.
Earlier this week, climate activist Vanessa Nakate helped kick off the meetings with a frank discussion on climate change. I had a chance to speak with her as soon as that wrapped up, and I asked her why it's so important for her to be here in person.
Well, I'm here to talk about the impact of the climate crisis in my country and across the African continent, and the need to listen to the voices that are on the front lines of the climate crisis.
You have a very powerful voice when it comes to climate change. What impact do you hope you can have at this crucial moment?
Well, at this moment, especially as we head for COP27, there are many things that are being discussed among activists, and one of them is the issue of loss and damage as we head to COP27, and the issue of climate finance. So climate finance is very key in this moment to help countries, especially those that are suffering right now as a result of the climate crisis, not only for mitigation and adaptation, but also a separate fund in place for loss and damage.
So what do you want to see happen practically now, and how soon does it have to happen?
Well, I want to see, the world listen to the science and accept that the climate crisis is here and it's happening right now. And to also see, some of the horrible realities of this crisis, that those on the front lines of this crisis are not responsible, and the need to help them, the need to help communities be lifted from energy poverty, the need to stop children, mothers from suffering as a result of, the droughts or the floods. And some of the things that need to be done is to really address the issue issue of climate finance. $100 billion was promised for the countries on the front lines of the climate crisis, but it hasn't yet been delivered, and it's no longer enough. So for me, the real action that I want to see right now is climate finance to be provided for those on the front lines, for mitigation, for adaptation, and also a separate fund in place for loss and damage.
So what do you want to say directly to those decision makers?
I want the decision makers to rise up for the people on the planet, to prioritize the lives of the people on the planet, and to make decisions that will ensure that communities are protected, that will ensure that communities thrive, that will ensure that the coming generations have a place they can call home. So history will tell whether this gathering took those very crucial steps.
Do you think it will?
I hope it will.
Vanessa Nagate, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Climate change is having an impact on food supplies around the world, and that scarcity, combined with rising prices due to inflation, is creating a food shock of its own. May Farid is a senior economist with the IMF. She's one of more than a dozen presenters in this year's Analytical Corners series, taking a deep dive into topics impacting economies around the world. Now, May, your paper deals with climate change and food insecurity, and from the beginning of the conflict with Ukraine, we heard about the particular impact that would have on Africa. Can you just paint the picture of what things are like on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. It's actually, it was an amazing, impressive piece of work that was done jointly with the African and the research department. And in that, we were actually trying to, just to put it in perspective, we looked at the big numbers. So looking at 345 million people that are food insecure around the world, out of which 128 million are in Sub-Saharan Africa. So obviously, an acute problem where people are unable to find enough nutrition or meet their own food consumption needs. So an incredibly chronic issue. Humanitarian cost is high, and the food insecurity problem was even more aggravated when it came to COVID pandemic, where we've seen Sub-Saharan Africa specifically, and with the war in Ukraine, came even under more pressure, with about 28 million people even added to that are food insecure.
But when you say, sorry to interrupt, but food insecurity, how does that look for a family on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I actually was going to take a step back and explain what food insecurity is. So we, in simple terms, it actually, or basic terms, it means food is not affordable. You cannot actually have enough money to purchase it. It's not available, so you cannot find enough of it. It is not nutritious enough, so the nutritional value in it is much less, and it's not sustainable. So you're in an environment where your environment is eroding your possibility of sustaining that crop next year or the year after. And that really brings me to, and I was following Minister Ahmed's intervention earlier about how climate change is putting even more pressure on Sub-Saharan Africa. And with that, actually, it is an underlying, critically underlying factor driving food insecurity in the region. So climate change, on top of all that, is actually resulting in putting more stress on the sustainability of the food system and ability to be able to provide the supply needed. So your food affordability, your food supply is less, and it becomes really a chronic problem that is just, with climate change intensifying and multiplying shocks in terms of climate shocks, droughts or floods. So in a nutshell, really, Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change, but on top of that is the least prepared to face it.
So it's a desperate situation to be in. What can be done?
So in our research, we focused more on exactly what can be done. So we focused on three main areas for fiscal policies, where actually there could be more targeted social assistance that could be in the form of cash transfers, so supplying families with the funds needed to be able to afford the food such that you can avert a humanitarian crisis. So, and on top of that, you could have more targeted subsidies. So you do have the subsidies, but make it more targeted. You have a clear spending behind it and an exit of it. And also more focused spending on climate resilient infrastructure. So basically make your roads more resilient to floods and invest in more seeds that could be drought resilient so they can withstand heat and extreme weather conditions. So this is one way you can actually help. And in another direction, we've also looked at trade integration. So how a bumper harvest in one country could actually result in solving a food shortage in another area of the region. So having more trade integration. And in that, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is one opportunity where you can actually increase growth opportunities and increase that trade corridor between the region. And we also looked at telecommunication and digitalization as the means that you could actually use technology to help in this effort. So for example, on digitalization, you could actually use mobile banking to provide for farmers access to finance and social assistance through also mobile banking. We've seen it used during the locust infestation in Kenya, would actually reduce the impact of it in 2020. So in a nutshell, these were all mechanisms where policymakers can do something about it.
And it's massively important work that millions of people are relying on. Mayfree, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, we could keep going for much longer, but we're almost at the end of IMF Today. Egypt is hosting COP27 aimed at tackling climate change next month, and Hala El Said will be there. She is Egypt's Minister of Planning and Economic Development, and I spoke to her a short time ago. So we're halfway through the week's meetings. What have your impressions been so far?
Well, actually, the IMF meeting comes at a very critical time. The whole world are witnessing unprecedented challenges with all the repercussions that are happening from the geopolitical challenges. We just came out of the recovery of the COVID pandemic, and then the world was hit with the geopolitical challenges. So I think it's very important for policymakers that operate in such a complex global setting to sit, discuss, analyze, and project the implication of this on their economies and how we go forward. So it's very fruitful. The meetings are very fruitful, and this is a very constructive and fruitful discussions going on.
You use the word complex. That is the word, isn't it, when you look at what's happening with the global economy in terms of inflation, interest rates, and Ukraine, COVID, climate change, all of these things that affect different countries, 190 countries in so many different ways. For your specific country, for Egypt, what are you hoping you can achieve? What do you need to achieve?
Well, actually, the multiple crises that the whole world are suffering from, and actually the emerging economies, the implication on the emerging economies in a country like Egypt are definitely more acute. Egypt is no exception from all the emerging economies. We have been working with the IMF through different programs. We have just successfully finished the program before, and now we are working on a structural reform agenda, a national homegrown structural reform agenda that the country is working on. And this structural reform agenda is basically focusing more on the real side of the economy. For the first time, we're working on the supply side of the economy, so we're enhancing the role of the manufacturing, ICT, and agriculture, and raising the resilience and the competitiveness of the Egyptian economy.
And as we can hear from the noise behind us, everyone's back in person. How much of a difference has that made to your negotiations and the progress that you hope to make?
It's very important. Physical presence is very important. We always say that the communication is one of the most important public goods for the economy. So I think communication and physical presence is very important. It's the human element in the communication and in the discussion is very important. We're also hosting COP27 in
ask you. So you've got your own big event coming up soon. Tell me more about that.
In less than 30 days, the whole government are mobilizing the efforts in order to have a very successful COP, and also to have a COP of implementation, not a talking COP, but an action COP. We're preparing, we have 10 thematic days, starting from after the World Leaders Summit. We have 10 thematic days, from the finance to the water to the adaptation and agriculture to the solutions day that we are responsible of, to the energy day, to the decarbonization day. So we have 10 thematic days. We have, of course, a lot of projects in the pipeline that we are preparing. Some of them are related to water desalination. Some projects are in the area of renewable energy. All projects that are basically related to more greening and more having less emissions, because of course the government of Egypt and the presidency of the COP are looking forward to ensure the green transition of the economy rapidly, but at the same time to ensure the interests and the needs of the developing and the African countries.
Best of luck with it all. Hala El Sayed, thank you so much for joining us on IMF Today.
Thank you.
So we're in full swing tomorrow as we enter day 4 of the IMF annual meetings. It begins with the managing director laying out her global policy agenda. We'll also have briefings on the first 3 of 5 regional economic outlooks, examining how specific areas will be impacted by this week's global outlook. G20 ministers and central bank governors are meeting, and we'll hear from the governors of Singapore, Armenia and Kenya as we wrap up our Governor Talks series. It's the first day of new economy forum sessions. We have 2 capacity development talks and a debate on the global economy. It all wraps up with that cultural event from Morocco. So it was a packed day. That's it for today from IMF Today. So many amazing images happening around these buildings every day this week. We'll leave you with some of the best of the day, and we'll see you again tomorrow.